The heart of Michael Armstrong proved itself to be a very generous one on this occasion. Some natural tears he shed, but wiped them soon, as he remembered that the more miserable the situation in which he was left, the more he ought to rejoice that Fanny had been taken from it. And he did rejoice, truly, sincerely, and at the very bottom of his heart did he rejoice. As day after day the hateful routine of unvarying suffering again laid its grasp upon his existence, with a power as irresistible as that of the vast engine which within those prison walls seemed lord of all, the generous heart of Mchl felt thankful that Fanny Fletcher shared in it no longer. It had been quite in vain that he had laboured to persuade himself, while listening to the reasonings of his little friend, that they ought mutually to rejoice in the probability of each other's death. Though he had allowed that, as far as he was himself concerned, he might easily be brought to think that it would be a comfort to die, he could never reach the pitch of sublimity necessary to form the wish that Fanny might die before him. But now it was evident that this weakness, which had more than once caused his little monastress to shake her head, and to say that he did not love her as well as she loved him, it was now quite evident that it was no selfish motive which had caused it. By degrees, this truly noble feeling, this general power of living, as it were, in the prosperity of another, so strengthened the character of the boy as perfectly to save him from the worst results of youthful suffering, a reckless, desperate despair, which, by destroying hope, that beautiful mainspring of all our best actions, leaves the poor spiritless machines alive only to the wretched consciousness of its capacity for pain. It is, beyond all question, this bitter hopelessness which deteriorates in so remarkable a manner the moral character of operatives under the present factory system. In no other situation, excepting that of slaves purchased and paid for like an ox, or an ass, is the destiny of a human being placed so wholly and completely beyond the reach of his own control. He is, as Wordsworth truly says, a slave to whom release comes not and cannot come. In other situations do labouring men, women, and children feel and know that unless they submit in all things to the behests of their employer, they must die, and that, too, by a process 10,000 times worse than either the hangman's cord or the headman's axe. They must die the death of famine. If their lingering hours of labour be prolonged beyond the stipulated time for which they are paid, they cannot turn and say, "I will not, for it is not in the bond." For the ready answer is, "Go. We employ none who make conditions with us." And where are they to go? To the parish officers? As ready an answer meets them there, "Go. We relieve none who can get work and refuse it." If they are fined, however unjustly, however arbitrarily, if the iniquitous truck system be restored to for payment of wages instead of money, if their women be insulted or their children crippled, and remonstrance follow, the same death-doom reply awaits them: "Go. We employ no grumblers here." Then to what quarter can they look with hope? Where are they to find that only elixir by which human strength is mercifully made for ever equal to sustain human suffering? The sparkling draught is not for them. The faculty operative alone of all to whom God has given power of thought is denied the delicious privilege of hope. It is this which degrades their nature. It is this which from youth to age renders one ruinous hour of brutal debauchery more precious than all the steadfast sober industry can promise or bestow. It was long, very long, ere this intellectual blight, this smothering mildew of the soul, fell upon Mchl, for he seemed to possess a sort of twofold existence, the worser half of it being his poor self, while the better was found in the happy destiny of Fanny. Countless were the miles that he walked backwards and forwards before the mules, during which he cheered his fancy by painting her in the midst of liberty and green fields. Sometimes he thought that if she were rich, she would remember all he had told her about his mother and Edward, and that she would find them out, would take compassion on their poverty, would talk of him, would soothe and comfort them. All this may seem to happier beings but a frail support under incessant labor, accompanied by every species of privation. Yet it did Mchl service. It kept his faculties alive, for it gave a theme, and a pleasant one, on which to fix his thoughts, and half the tedium of his own sad life was forgotten, as he meditated on the probable happiness of hers. Sometimes, it must be owned, though he always told himself that such thoughts were nonsense, ideas would suggest themselves less abstractly disinterested, for it would now and then come into his head that Fanny Fletcher knew where Sir Matthew had sent him, if nobody else did, and that, perhaps, if she grew to be a great girl, with power to do what she liked, she might think of him, and try to do something to rescue him. Vague as was this notion, vague as he felt himself to be, vague as he himself felt it to be, it was a blessing to him. When such thoughts arose, his bodily strength seemed to revive, his aching knees no longer bent under him, his gait was no longer that of an ordinary factory child, the energy of his mind lent itself to his limbs, and wearily as he stretched himself upon his bed of straw, and long and lanky as his half-starved person grew, Mchl Armstrong did not become a cripple. But years wore away, and the stout-hearted young prisoner of Deep Valley began again to think that he had better have died of the fever than have lived so long, hoping for some happy chance to set him free, and hoping for ever and for ever in vain. "I am a fool," argued Mchl at 14. "I am a fool for thinking so very much of one who is quite plain has never thought of me, nor of mother, nor of my poor Edward either. She never gave a thought to either of us. I was a fool to dream it. The fine folks that carried her away took her far enough from sight and sound of factory people. And who can blame her? She never turned her head back again to inquire about any of them. Poor little Fanny, she was very kind to Roe once, and she was the very prettiest little girl that ever I happened to see. But other people may have found out by this time as well as I. Fanny Fletcher is a whole year older than me. I will try with all my might and main never to think of her any more." This resolution was not very steadily adhered to, but the struggle to do it, which was perfectly sincere, made the poor boy moody and more miserable than ever. His dreams perpetually represented to him his mother and helpless brother, suffering from some unkindness from Fanny, whom he saw superlatively beautiful and superlatively rich, but more superlatively hard-hearted still. These nervous and irritating visitations brought his mother and brother so vividly before him that for weeks he could never, whether waking or sleeping, get them out of his head. He fancied himself again running at full speed from Dowling Lodge, with Martha's basket on his arm. His mother's little room, decent and orderly in spite of poverty, came back upon his mind as if he had left it but yesterday. He saw the soft expression of her faded countenance, and felt the welcome of her fond embrace. "O fool! O proud and wicked fool!" he murmured to his tear-stained pillow, as these and 1,000 other tender recollections pressed upon him. "Why could I not endure the tyrant's cruelty? I might have kissed her now. I might have comforted poor Teddy." The sound of his own voice as he pronounced this dear familiar name, though in a whisper too low to awaken the weary sleepers round him, wrung his very heart by the vivid recollection which it brought, and though he was now beyond 14 years old, he cried himself to sleep. Fitful and feverish were the transitions of his mind at this period. Sometimes he persuaded himself that his mother was no more, that the loss of him had broken her heart, that she had died, believing him to have gone before her. At other times it was Edward whom he wept for, as dead. His shattered health, his feeble limbs were, as he thought, sure evidence that nature meant him not to struggle long against the misery of his lot, and there were moments in which this persuasion even soothed him. Sweet fellow, he thought. How calm and beautiful he must have looked in death. Even in suffering, even in agony, his countenance was lovely, so patient and so heavenly, mild. Better, far better he should die than live a factory boy like me. and then again his mood would change, and he had forever before him images of the most fearful destitution, his mother starving, and Edward slowly perishing beside her, because he had been too proud and too impatient to endure sundry buffetings and other indignities, which, when put in competition with the thought of having injured them, dwindled into petty injuries, which he deserved eternal shame for shrinking from. Dreadful were the hours he thus spent, and, fearful to think of it, was the hopeless, helpless, joyless, comfortless existence by which he had held to earth. His very soul sickened as he looked around him, and read in every withered, melancholy face the history of blasted youth and the prophecy of premature death. But there are spirits which sorrow and suffering cannot quench, and Mchl Armstrong's was one of them. Nature and accident together had been stronger than the tendency of his employment to cripple his limbs, and he was neither deformed nor stunted. This happy exemption from the common lot was doubtless greatly owing to the pertinacity of Molly Bing in proving to Messrs. Woodcombe and Poulet that she was no fool, and knew well enough what she was about. This steadfastness on her part, acting in unison with the superintendent's judicious objections to Mchl's being buried at that particular time, had certainly given a very critical and efficient impulse to the vigor of a frame of great natural strength and comeliness. The energetic, self-sustaining soul within it had also much to do in defying the paralyzing influences of his miserable situation. It was rarely that Mchl could be seen to drag his limbs along, even in the last hours of long protracted labor, with the same crippled, dipping gait as his companions. A broken-spirited child, when his knees are aching, permits them to bend under him, and not 1 in 50, perhaps, of the half-starved, overworked apprentices of the deep valley reached the term of their captivity without carrying away with them some species of bodily weakness or deformity. But let the reason be what it might, Mchl was saved from this, and though exhibiting a fabric composed of little besides skin, bone, and sinew, he was, at the age of 14 years and 6 months, both tall and straight. But it seemed as if the inward strength of mental suffering kept pace with this vigor of frame, for day by day the bitter consciousness of his own wretched and degraded state increased upon him, and day by day his swelling heart grew more indignant as he looked around him and watched the exercise of lawless power and cowardly tyranny upon his miserable companions. It was after a particularly hateful display of this power by an act of insult too disgusting to relate, upon the unresisting person of a little fellow who seemed crawling, only too slowly, to the grave, that Mchl, when every other sufferer in the chamber was fast asleep, set himself to meditate gravely and deliberately upon his own situation. He had that day been so near trying the power of his bony arms by flying at the throat of the ruffian who had so revoltingly outraged his companion, that with more than boyish judgment he became conscious of the growing danger that beset him. Though he had felt almost to suffocation the boiling rage which nothing but injustice and the pitiful abuse of adventurous power can generate, he was not such a Quixote as to hope that his arm could effectively redress the wrongs he witnessed. Yet he thought with a sort of trembling exultation that if he had seized the craven overlooker as he kicked him from the helpless object of his tyranny, he might have held him with a grasp that would have stopped his breath forever. It was a horrid and murderous thought, and poor Mchl, once the gentlest, fondest little heart that ever nestled to a mother's bosom, did penance for it by a pang of self-condemnation that made him grind his teeth in agony. Yet even then the goaded spirit seemed to rise in rebellion against his own remorse. "I cannot bear it!" he exclaimed in smothered accents, as he turned his face towards his bed of straw. "I know I cannot bear it long. I have seen 2 attempts to escape, who have been brought back to frightful tortures, to I know not what. A solitary cell? The whip? The knotted thong? What matters? Would they could slaughter me at once. All would be over then." For a long, still hour that feverish night the boy lay sleepless. A terrible conviction that there was something within him which might prove stronger than himself, stronger than all his mother's precepts, and the holy fear of God, which they had left upon his mind, made him feel sick with horror and shudder in abhorrence of his own wickedness. He prayed to God to give him power to turn his thoughts from this, and soothe to calmness by the healing act. He meditated with passion and with great acuteness for his years upon the probable result of attempting to escape. The difficulties of the enterprise were greater than any can imagine who know not the locality and the intricate network of security which surround the imprisoned apprentices of Deep Valley on all sides. Of this the elder children and the few who lived to approach their majority were by no means ignorant. Considerable pains were indeed taken to impress upon their minds the certainty of their being caught, if they succeeded in clearing the walls, together with the important fact that, as apprentices, it was illegal to assist them in running away from their master, and that it was the duty of every justice of peace to assist in securing and sending them back to complete the term fixed in their indenture. All this Mchl knew perfectly well, neither was he at all sanguine in his hopes of avoiding the toils from which he had never heard that any had escaped. Yet he determined to make the attempt, assuring himself that no change in the treatment he received could render him more miserable, and sincerely thinking that it would be better and safer for him, should the failure of this desperate attempt lead to such a degree of restraint as would render the yielding to such violence of emotion as had that day seized upon him impossible. Having come to this conclusion, and firmly pledged his young spirit to the attempt, his feverish restlessness subsided, and he dropped asleep. The waking of the next morning was unlike any he had ever known before. He no longer felt as one among a miserable crew, sharing in common with them starvation, labor, and indignity. He felt himself to be one alone and apart from all. He was on the eve of doing that which would involve him in difficulties and dangers altogether new and strange to him, and the termination he could really be said to expect was the being dragged back to his prison to suffer all that it was in the power of his tyrants to inflict. These were strange materials for meditation, which was decidedly agreeable, yet such Mchl felt it to be, in spite of reason. A sensation of active, dauntless courage swelled in his breast, which, with all the danger it threatened, was well worth the heavy monotony of his ordinary existence. At times, too, a gleam of hope would dart across the stern and steady gloom of the prospects, and during the moment that flash lasted, he saw himself restored to his mother and Edward. He could hardly be said to hope this, yet the feeling that it was possible sufficed to sustain his spirits through the days and nights which preceded the attempt. It was exactly by the same exit that poor crazy Sally had made use of some 50 years before, that Mchl determined to leave the premises. The month or two during which he had been employed in cleaning the yard and its appurtenances had made him thoroughly well acquainted with the outward door, and also with the region immediately beyond it, for it was thither that he was accustomed to convey all the rubbish which it was his office to remove, an office which might have been attended with some danger of the escape of him who performed it, had not those in authority taken care to inform him that no celerity of step could avail against the watchfulness of certain eyes about the factory, which were always on the alert to reconnoitre that door, and never far distant from the commodious windows which gave them power to do so. Poor Sally had found this but too surely in making her attempts, and Mchl had more than once listened to the merry tradition, which was a favourite story with the overlookers, of how the silly girl had run in full sight of a dozen watchful eyes, till her strength had failed, and she sank down among the bushes and was taken, like a bird that, having been long confined, has no strength of wing left to bear him beyond reach of the first hand extended to recapture him. Yet this open postern was the only one by which it was possible to pass. But the very extremity of the danger of passing it made the attempt easy, for though it was always carefully locked at night, and the key placed together with those of every external door on the premises, under the pillow of Mr. Woodcombe, the manager, had more than once seen a miserable little head peeping through it when left open for the passage of the wheelbarrow, without testifying the least alarm. The time chosen by Mchl for passing this terrible door was that during which the dirty herd were commanded to expose their faces and hands for a short moment to such cleansing as might be obtained in a huge trough, in company with a score or two of competitors. It was constantly a moment of great noise, bustle, and hustling, and it was in the midst of this that the young adventurer contrived, unobserved, to push back the only bolt which secured the door during the day, leaving it in a position to yield noiselessly to a very slight touch. At the sound of a bell, which rang about 10 minutes after the children were turned out into the court to wash themselves, the whole troop hurried back again to the apprentice house for their breakfast. It was then that Mchl, often the last to finish the too short operation of washing, remained for a moment behind the rest, and in that moment, opening the door just wide enough for his slender figure to pass, he slipped through and closed it after him. The interval which elapsed before his departure was suspected, certainly did not exceed 2 minutes, and before the expiration of 10, the fact was completely ascertained and known to nearly every inmate of the mill. Mr. Poulet's second wife, to whom he had been married about 3 years, was in appearance the very reverse of the first, being as remarkably small as the other was large, but what she wanted in muscle was made up in watchfulness. Nothing escaped her restless and malignant little eyes, and either from the incessant danger of her spying sharpness, or the propensity of the human mind to think present suffering worse than every other, there were many who declared that they would be glad to have her brutal predecessor back again. It was this woman who first descried the absence of Mchl from the board. "Hullo! Where is number 57? She cried. No one could answer, and number 57 was sought for in vain from one end of the premises to the other. He's gone through the yard door," proclaimed the active and intelligent Mrs. Poulet, after discovering that the bolt was withdrawn. "Off with you, you stupid old fool," she added, addressing her husband. "What are you standing there for? If you had the wit of a jackass, you might trace him by his feet on the dew, for there are the marks plain enough to anybody that has sense enough to look for 'em." And so in truth there were. A continuous track of footmarks were easily traced from the door to the steep bank behind the factory, where they were lost in the covert of bushes, which had late of years been coaxed to close sides for the purpose of furnishing faggots. That some one had recently broken through these bushes was equally evident, from many boughs having been torn, and the soil beneath them trampled. This was enough to direct the pursuit with so much certainty of being right that Mr. Woodcombe laughed as he gave the orders for it. "The bushes last for about half a mile," said he, "and then he must take over the hills, of course. Fine fellow, isn't he? It will be mighty hard to take him again, won't it? There'll only be 3 justices of the peace for him to be handed to, and only every man he meets ready to introduce him. The worst misfortune is that I don't quite see where he is to get his dinner." 2 stout overlookers started accordingly upon the track thus easily hit upon, and Mr. Woodcombe awaited the results of their exertions without the slightest anxiety or any irritation of nerves whatever, albeit he knew that, favoured as he was, he might run no small risk of losing his place should one of the apprentices really escape. But the thing was impossible. No one could live without eating, not even one who had served his apprenticeship to starving as well as piecing at the Deep Valley Mill. So Mr. Woodcombe slept soundly, although in ignorance of the fact that Mchl Armstrong was already within a few feet of his premises.